Sevastopol, Crimea, winter 1942. The German army is closing in from the north, their artillery tearing through the frozen hills that overlook the Black Sea. Amid the chaos, one rifle remains steady, the worn wooden stock of a Mosin Nagant pressed against a cold cheek. The sniper behind it is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, 25 years old, already feared across the Eastern Front. Her trigger discipline is surgical. She doesn't miss. Every pull of the bolt echoes a name, a memory, a debt. Within months, her confirmed kills will pass 300, each one logged with precision, each one delivered without hesitation. To the Germans, she becomes Lady Death, a phantom whose bullets appear before her presence is ever seen. Her war is not chaos, but calculation. Her calm is not mercy, but focus. In the ruins of Sevastopol, where soldiers freeze faster than they bleed, one woman turns grief into vengeance, and vengeance into history. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was born on July 12, 1916, in the small Ukrainian town of Belaya Tsurkov, then part of the Russian Empire. Her childhood unfolded during a period of upheaval, revolutions, famine, and the violent birth of the Soviet state. She grew up in a working-class family that believed in discipline and patriotism, values that would later harden into the foundations of her character. As a child, she was competitive, athletic, and fiercely independent. She ran, climbed, and raced with neighborhood boys, often to prove that she was equal, sometimes to prove she was better. Her mother worked as a teacher. Her father served in the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. From him, she inherited a soldier's precision and a sense of national duty that would define her destiny. By her late teens, Lyudmila had moved with her family to Kiev, a growing industrial city on the Dnieper River. She enrolled at Kiev University to study history, an unusual path for a young woman at the time. But her mind worked like a rifle sight, focused, linear, and exact. She read about wars and empires, revolutions and betrayals, and in every story she found a pattern that victory favored the disciplined, not the reckless. To earn extra money, she worked part-time at the Kiev Arsenal munitions plant, where she first handled firearms. When a coworker challenged her to join a local shooting club, she accepted. The rifle quickly became an extension of her body. Within months, she was competing in marksmanship tournaments under the Soviet paramilitary sport organization Ossoviakim. Her instructors noted her control. She rarely blinked, never rushed a trigger, and recorded near-perfect accuracy scores. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Pavlichenko was still a student. The following year, while Europe burned, she graduated and began postgraduate studies, dreaming of a quiet career as a historian. But on June 22, 1941, those plans ended. At dawn, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching 2,000 kilometers. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies collapsed. Kiev, her home, came under siege. Villages burned, civilians fled, and the Red Army reeled under the speed of blitzkrieg. The Soviet government called for volunteers. Men of all ages enlisted, and women joined auxiliary units as nurses or clerks. Pavlichenko refused to serve behind the front. She walked into a recruitment office in Kiev and requested assignment as a sniper. The officer laughed, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. Women, he told her, were not meant for the front line. She placed her sharpshooting certificates on his desk. The laughter stopped. After a brief marksmanship test, she was accepted into the 25th Rifle Division of the Red Army, assigned the rank of junior lieutenant, armed with the Mosin Nagant M1890-130 rifle fitted with a 4-power PU scope. Her training was swift and brutal. The Soviet Union was desperate. Recruits were rushed to the front with minimal preparation. Pavlichenko's first assignment came near Odessa, a port city on the Black Sea under constant bombardment from the German and Romanian armies. The front was chaos. a blur of mud, smoke, and shattered walls. Her first confirmed kill was not heroic, it was necessary. A German scout crept toward a Soviet trench. She waited, adjusted for wind, and fired. He dropped instantly. The shock was physical. She later recalled feeling both sickness and calm, a contradiction that would follow her for the rest of the war. By the end of her first 2 days in combat, she had taken down 2 enemy soldiers. By the end of her first month, the count reached dozens. Snipers were not ordinary soldiers. They operated alone or in pairs, often lying motionless for hours in freezing temperatures, watching and waiting. Pavlichenko learned to read terrain like a textbook, tree lines, shadow lengths, the color of disturbed snow. She camouflaged her position with patience and intelligence rather than luck. Her notebook recorded every engagement: distance, direction, bullet drop, wind speed, time of day. Her precision turned killing into arithmetic and arithmetic into survival. She hunted officers first, then machine gunners, then observers. Each shot slowed the German advance by removing leadership and coordination. The 25th Division began to whisper about the young woman with the calm eyes who never missed. As the siege of Odessa intensified through late 1941, Soviet lines held against repeated assaults. Pavlichenko's presence became both tactical and psychological. For her comrades, she was proof that discipline could overcome fear. For the Germans, she became a name passed between units, a ghost whose bullets struck unseen. By the time Odessa fell and Soviet forces withdrew to Sevastopol, her tally exceeded 100 confirmed. Kills. Her husband, also a soldier, was killed during the retreat. The loss hardened her resolve. Grief no longer paralyzed her, it directed her. Revenge stopped being emotion and became structure. Her life narrowed to a scope's crosshair and the distant silhouettes that crossed it. Sevastopol became her new battleground. The city, perched on high cliffs above the Black Sea, was the last Soviet bastion in southern Ukraine. Its fall would give Germany full control of the Crimean Peninsula and threaten the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. The siege began in October 1941 and would last until July 1942. Temperatures dropped below freezing, food and ammunition ran out, and soldiers fought among the ruins of their own homes. Amid the cold and hunger, Pavlichenko's methodical calm stood out. She crawled through shell craters, buried herself under snow, and waited for hours to make a single shot. German snipers tried to locate her, but her patience outlasted theirs. On several occasions, she engaged in duels that lasted entire days, each side waiting for the other to move first. In every case, she fired the final shot. By the start of 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was already a legend within the Red Army. Her confirmed count surpassed 200, though the real number was likely higher. Many kills went unverified in the chaos of battle. Soviet commanders began using her not only as a sniper, but as a trainer, passing on her precision and discipline to new recruits. She taught them that a sniper's first weapon was not the rifle but the mind. Patience, observation, calculation, these principles defined her. Her name appeared in military reports and propaganda bulletins. Yet to Pavlichenko, recognition meant little. Her focus remained absolute. Avenge the fallen, defend Sevastopol, hold the line. Every shot she fired was both tactical and personal. Each German officer she eliminated weakened the enemy's command, and in her own mind, repaid a portion of the debt left by her husband's death. She never celebrated her kills. She documented them with the cold efficiency of a historian recording data. When asked later how she endured the psychological weight, she answered simply, "A sniper's job is to kill. If you tremble, you're dead." By early 1942, as Sevastopol prepared for another wave of assault, Pavlichenko had already become one of the deadliest snipers in history. Her war was no longer about survival, it was about control. In a world collapsing under fire, she found order in precision. Every shot she fired was a line of resistance carved into history. By the winter of 1941–42, the Eastern Front had become a frozen graveyard stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, launched only months earlier with confidence of a swift victory, was now slowing under snow, exhaustion, and Soviet resistance. In the south, the Crimean Peninsula, gateway to the Black Sea, had become a priority objective. Its capture would secure German supply lines, protect the Romanian oil fields, and threaten Soviet control of the Caucasus. The task was given to General Erich von Manstein's 11th Army, supported by Luftwaffe dive bombers and Romanian divisions. Against them stood the battered remnants of the Soviet 51st and 44th Armies, holding on to the fortress city of Sevastopol, headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. Inside those ruins, Lyudmila Pavlichenko continued her silent campaign. The front around Sevastopol was not a single line, but a labyrinth of craters, ravines, and shattered concrete. German artillery thundered day and night. The largest pieces were the 600mm Karl Jarret mortars and the colossal 800mm Dora railway gun, which could fire a 7-ton shell more than 20 miles. Pavlichenko learned to measure the rhythm between barrages and used the short pauses to relocate. Her camouflage evolved with the landscape, white smocks in snow, soot-darkened cloth when the ground turned to mud. She moved alone, sometimes crawling for hours just to gain a clear shot at a machine gun nest or an observation officer. By early 1942, she had become both a legend and an instructor. The Soviet command realized her talent could not remain singular. In basements converted to classrooms, she trained recruits, many scarcely older than 17, in the fundamentals of range estimation and concealment. Ammunition was scarce, so she drilled them on breathing and trigger control using empty rifles. "A sniper," she said, "must count to calm the pulse before the bullet counts for him." Those she trained later formed sniper platoons across the Sevastopol defense sector, each one an echo of her precision. The wider war pressed in. Far to the north, the Battle of Moscow had ended in Germany's first major defeat. Hitler's dream of taking the Soviet capital had collapsed under the weight of winter, but Manstein's army in Crimea remained relentless. In March 1942, the Germans launched Operation Trappenjagd, Bastard Hunt, encircling the Soviet 44th Army near Kerch and slaughtering more than 150,000 men. The survivors fell back towards Sevastopol, tightening the noose around the fortress. Pavlichenko's division, the 25th Rifle Division, was redeployed from the eastern perimeter to reinforce the northern heights. The air smelled of oil, dust, and gunpowder, the sound of the sea mixed with the constant whistle of shells. Pavlichenko's daily existence followed a relentless pattern. She rose before dawn, checked wind direction with a scrap of cloth, and moved to her assigned sector. Her notebook recorded distances, wind speeds, ammunition count, and the day's tally. The Red Army officially verified 309 confirmed kills, but the true figure was likely higher. Verification required witnesses, often impossible amid collapsing trenches. Most of her targets were officers, machine gunners, and enemy snipers. She engaged at ranges up to 600 meters, compensating for wind and bullet drop through pure mental calculation. Her discipline turned survival into geometry. The Germans, aware of her reputation, attempted to eliminate her through counter-snipers. On several occasions, she entered long duels, hours of stillness punctuated by single flashes of light. One such duel near the Inkerman Valley lasted 3 days. Each morning she returned to the same shallow hollow, scanning for the faint glint of an opposing lens. On the 3rd day she found it. Her bullet shattered the rival scope. The silence afterward was absolute. She recorded the victory as number 257. Meanwhile, Sevastopol was dying. Supplies from the mainland arrived only by submarine or small fishing boats under cover of darkness. Casualties filled underground hospitals carved into limestone cliffs. Diseases spread through the damp air. Soviet leadership in Moscow ordered the city to hold at all costs, not for strategic reasons alone, but for morale. Sevastopol symbolized Soviet endurance. In May 1942, Manstein opened his final assault. The Luftwaffe flew more than 2,000 sorties a day, dropping thousands of tons of explosives. Entire districts vanished. The great dry docks of the harbor became craters. Pavlichenko worked amid the ruins, guiding new snipers, sometimes using fallen masonry as cover. Her uniform was torn, her face wind-burned and pale from exhaustion, but her aim never faltered. On June 6, 1942, during a reconnaissance near the Malakhov Kurgan, she was wounded by mortar fragments that tore into her face and shoulder. The blast left her unconscious. Comrades dragged her through a maze of tunnels to a field. Hospital. Even under anesthesia, she reportedly tried to sit up and ask for her rifle. Doctors operated in candlelight, the power long gone. When she awoke, she demanded to return to the front, but the medical staff refused. High Command intervened. The Red Army could not risk losing its most celebrated sniper. She was evacuated by submarine across the Black Sea to Novorossiysk, one of the last to leave before Sevastopol finally fell on July 4, 1942. The fall of Sevastopol was catastrophic. Roughly 100,000 Soviet troops were captured, tens of thousands more were killed. Manstein reported victory to Berlin, and Hitler promoted him to field marshal. Yet for the Soviet people, defeat carried a different meaning. Out of the city's ashes came symbols, stories of last stands, of women soldiers, of endurance against impossible odds. Among them, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's name stood above the rest. Her record was unparalleled in modern warfare, and in the darkest period of Soviet history, she became evidence that defiance still lived. Her evacuation did not end her service. While she recovered in hospital beds scattered across the Caucasus, Soviet propagandists began publishing her photograph. The black and white image, serious face, fur-lined cap, rifle across the chest, circulated in newspapers from Moscow to Vladivostok. To millions who had lost relatives in the German advance, she represented both vengeance and survival. Official bulletins credited her with 309 verified kills, including 36 enemy snipers. German intelligence acknowledged her impact. Intercepted documents referred to a female marksman terrorizing the southern sector. Fear became part of her effectiveness. When she finally stood again, walking with difficulty, she learned that the Soviet High Command had reassigned her. The order was simple: no more frontline duty. Instead, she would serve as an instructor and a symbol. By midsummer 1942, she was summoned to Moscow to meet with officials from the Soviet Information Bureau. There she received new orders to travel abroad as part of a goodwill mission to the Western Allies. Stalin's government wanted the world to see a living emblem of Soviet resolve, not abstract statistics. Pavlichenko hesitated. She wanted to return to her unit, but obedience was not optional. In August 1942, she boarded a transport plane bound for Tehran, then London, and finally Washington, D.C. The mission's goal was political: to persuade the Allies to open a second front in Europe and relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. To the Western press, she was introduced as Lady Death, the Soviet sniper who killed 309 Nazis. For the first time, a woman in combat uniform became the face of a nation at war. When she spoke at rallies in Canada and the United States, audiences of thousands listened in stunned silence. Her English was limited, her tone coldly factual. "I am 26 years old," she said, "and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The crowd erupted. The message was unmistakable. Her composure impressed even seasoned politicians. In Washington, she met Eleanor Roosevelt, who later wrote that Pavlichenko possessed the quiet confidence of someone who has looked at death too many times to fear it. The two women toured factories and military bases. an image of solidarity between nations that only months earlier had been strangers. Pavlichenko, dressed in her olive uniform adorned with medals, refused to smile for photographers. She was not a celebrity, she was a witness. By the end of 1942, she returned to Moscow carrying both fame and fatigue. Sevastopol was gone, but her legend had outlived the fortress. The Soviet state promoted her to major and awarded her the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor available. Behind the medals, however, stood a woman who had seen too much to celebrate. The war continued to rage from Stalingrad to Leningrad, and she knew more snipers were dying every day following her example. She resumed her duties as an instructor, shaping the next generation of marksmen who would fight through the long winter ahead. Her war had shifted from the scope to the classroom, but the purpose remained unchanged: to teach precision, to survive, and to make every bullet count. To understand Lyudmila Pavlichenko's legend, one must separate myth from method. Her fame did not come from propaganda alone. It came from the mechanical precision of her actions repeated under impossible conditions. She was not a product of chance, but of structure, a soldier who turned emotion into geometry. The woman who would become Lady Death was not driven by rage, but by order. In a war consumed by chaos, her discipline became her rebellion. Her transformation began with loss. When her husband was killed during the Odessa campaign, Pavlichenko did not collapse under grief. She absorbed it like recall and redirected it through control. Every sniper learns that a shaking hand is death, emotion clouds sight, and hesitation gives the enemy a heartbeat's advantage. Pavlichenko mastered stillness until it became her armor. Witnesses from her unit described her posture before each shot: body flat against the ground, elbows locked, cheek welded to the rifle stock. She exhaled slowly until her pulse steadied, then squeezed the trigger as if signing her name. The bullet's flight was the only movement allowed. Her rifle, the Mosin, Nagant M189130, was standard issue, a 5-round bolt-action weapon firing a 7.62x 50 cartridge with a maximum effective range of 800 meters. The rifle itself was crude by modern standards, heavy and difficult to cycle quickly, but in her hands it became an instrument of mathematics. She adjusted for wind, elevation, and distance instinctively. She kept meticulous notes on bullet drop patterns, recording in her notebook how far a projectile would fall at specific ranges and temperatures. The Mosin's 4-power PU scope offered limited visibility compared to German Zeiss optics, yet she learned to compensate through pattern recognition. The angle of a helmet, the shadow cast by a rifle barrel, the outline of a man against snow. Her accuracy was not the product of technology, but of intellect. Pavlichenko's hunts followed a pattern. She preferred dawn or late afternoon when the light was oblique and shadows stretched long across the terrain. She observed movement, not color. A single careless shift of weight or a glint of glass was enough to betray a target. Once she selected her victim, she waited. Patience defined her war more than bullets. She could lie motionless for hours, enduring hunger, insects, and cold, knowing that a single moment of exposure would reverse the hunt. Snipers were both predators and prey. German counter-snipers scoured the front for her signature firing positions. She adapted by changing her angle daily, never using the same nest twice. In this cat-and-mouse warfare, Pavlichenko learned to think like the enemy, predicting where a sniper would hide, where an observer would stand, and where a commander would expose himself to survey the field. Every confirmed kill was recorded in her logbook. She did not count bodies, she counted results. Officers first, then specialists, machine gunners, radio men, artillery observers. Each elimination disrupted the structure of a German unit. In modern terms, her work would be called forced decapitation, but to her it was simple arithmetic. Remove the head, the body hesitates. In the Battle of Sevastopol, this tactic was invaluable. The German advance slowed, not only under artillery fire, but under uncertainty. Commanders learned to crouch, to avoid exposing themselves to second-guess their positions. One Soviet report noted that enemy officers now crawl as privates do. Pavlichenko's bullets created hesitation, and hesitation in warfare is death by seconds. Beyond her skill, her psychological endurance distinguished her. A sniper's isolation was as lethal as enemy fire. They operated alone for long stretches, often in no man's land where artillery and mortars blurred friend from foe. Many soldiers succumbed to nerves, firing prematurely or abandoning positions under imagined threat. Pavlichenko treated fear as a signal, not an emotion. She once wrote that the body tells you what it needs to survive. The mind must decide if it will listen. Her ability to suppress instinct, to stay when every sense screamed to move, separated professionals from casualties. In this sense, she waged two wars simultaneously, one against the Germans, another against her own humanity. The Red Army recognized her value early. By mid-1942, Pavlichenko was instructing sniper detachments across multiple sectors of the Southern Front. She emphasized that a sniper's true weapon was intelligence. She trained soldiers to study enemy patterns, meal times, shift rotations, observation habits. Her trainees were taught to blend with terrain, to mask breathing with battlefield noise, and to understand when not to fire. The difference between a hunter and a killer, she explained, is timing. Under her instruction, Soviet sniper efficiency increased dramatically. Their presence turned narrow sectors of the front into killing zones where German patrols hesitated to move even during daylight. The tactical efficiency of Soviet snipers influenced the broader Eastern Front. After 1942, the Red Army formed dedicated sniper battalions, a concept inspired directly by Pavlichenko's results. Her methods were documented in manuals and passed to thousands of new recruits. The German Wehrmacht responded by deploying specialized counter-sniper units equipped with optical camouflage and high-powered rifles, but even they struggled against her unpredictability. German reports mention that the female sniper in the southern sector has changed her firing axis again, impossible to triangulate. Her mind was a moving front line. Yet behind the methodical soldier remained a woman carrying the quiet grief of loss. Her letters home, fragments of which survived the war, reveal exhaustion more than pride. She wrote of the cold, of the sound of distant church bells before bombardments, and of the faces of fallen comrades she could not forget. The Soviet press painted her as a symbol of strength, but Pavlichenko herself viewed her work as a duty, not a triumph. Each death was necessary, she told an interviewer in 1943, but none were satisfying. The emotion she denied on the battlefield returned at night, in silence, when even the sound of her own breathing felt too loud. Her revenge, though born of personal loss, had evolved into something impersonal, a function of war. The death of her husband had set her on this path, but by Sevastopol she was no longer killing for him. She was killing for momentum, for survival, for the defense of the soil beneath her body. Her precision, once emotional, became institutional. Soviet propaganda amplified her image, but it could not capture the complexity of her transformation. Pavlichenko was not merely a hero. She was evidence of what total war could forge when emotion was distilled into purpose. By the time she left the battlefield, she had achieved something both terrifying and remarkable. She had made vengeance efficient. Her kills were counted, verified, recorded, and publicized, but their meaning belonged only to her. The Germans called her Frau Todd, the woman of death. Her comrades called her Luda. Between those names lay the truth, a young woman who had learned to control her sorrow so completely that it became indistinguishable from discipline. Her humanity remained intact, but buried under layers of calculation. Even in recovery, when journalists asked her what she felt during combat, she answered plainly, "I felt my work was necessary." That sentence defined her, a soldier without embellishment, a historian turned executioner, a widow who found logic in vengeance. Lyudmila Pavlichenko embodied the convergence of intellect and survival, and in doing so, she redefined what war expected of women. She was not an exception, she was evolution. War tests the limits of the human mind long before it destroys the body. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the battlefield was not only a place of survival, but a laboratory of endurance. Each mission demanded silence, patience, and the suppression of instinct. She learned that fear, when unacknowledged, becomes chaos, but when studied, becomes control. The rifle was not merely a tool of death, it was a discipline of thought. Through its scope, she saw not men, but positions, coordinates, and calculations. It was a necessary abstraction, one that allowed her to continue functioning in an environment where empathy was a liability. Yet beneath that precision lived a human conscience. Her contemporaries described moments when she sat alone after missions, cleaning her rifle with the precision of ritual. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were spare. "The work is done," she would say quietly, before folding her cleaning cloth and placing it back into her pouch. To the untrained observer, she seemed cold, almost mechanical. But those who served beside her understood that her silence was not absence, it was preservation. To feel everything in war was to die before the bullet arrived. German soldiers feared her long before they ever saw her. Intelligence intercepts from 1942 refer to a woman sniper active in Sevastopol responsible for high officer losses. Reports circulated across German lines warning troops not to expose themselves in daylight. One Wehrmacht diary recovered after the battle recorded the words, "The Russian woman is death herself. We cannot see her, but she sees us all." Fear became her shadow ally. Every rumor magnified her reach, every exaggeration added to her legend. When a sniper turns mythic, even empty fields feel haunted. In warfare, perception is often deadlier than bullets. The psychological war she waged against the enemy mirrored the one she fought within. The Red Army glorified her kill count, printing her statistics as proof of Soviet resilience. But she understood the cost of every number. Each verified kill was a confirmation of her own transformation, the distance between the historian she had been and the soldier she had become. Her background in history gave her a rare awareness of legacy. She knew that the stories of wars were built on selective memory. What she could not control was which version of herself would survive that process, the woman or the weapon. Soviet propaganda reduced her complexity to a slogan. Posters called her the Avenger of Sevastopol. Films depicted her as a flawless heroine, a smiling sniper framed in patriotic light. But the reality was far colder. Pavlichenko never smiled for official portraits. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, carried the fatigue of someone who had looked at the same horizon for too long. Western journalists who met her during her 1942 tour of the United States described her as reserved, analytical, and difficult to engage emotionally. She answered questions with precision, not charm. When asked what it felt like to kill, she responded, "I only regret I could not kill more before they wounded me." The words were factual, not boastful. To her, statistics were not vanity. They were validation that her husband's death and her nation's suffering had not been for nothing. The moral paradox of Lyudmila Pavlichenko lies in her dual identity, both instrument of death and symbol of justice. The West romanticized her as a female avenger, a rare inversion of gender expectation. The Soviets portrayed her as the embodiment of communist equality, a woman equal to any man in courage and skill. But to Pavlichenko herself, the labels were irrelevant. She saw her work not as heroism, but as necessity. Her revenge, once personal, had become national. And yet, the more she served that purpose, the further she drifted from her own humanity. That distance was not visible, but it existed in the quiet moments between missions, in the way she folded her gloves with mechanical care, in the way she avoided eye contact when others spoke of home. Psychologists who later studied the mental conditioning of snipers often cited Pavlichenko as a case study in compartmentalization. Her ability to detach emotion from action was not innate. It was cultivated through repetition and survival. The act of observing death through a scope, over and over, rewires perception. The world becomes divided into movement and stillness, threat and absence, calculation and void. When she left the battlefield, she carried that conditioning with her. Even during her public appearances abroad, she remained hyper-aware of her surroundings, noting exits, observing body language, assessing distances. Combat had changed the way she saw the world. It had trained her to measure rather than feel. The enemy, too, adapted to her existence. The Germans deployed counter-sniper specialists using high-powered Mauser rifles fitted with telescopic sights. Some attempted deception, planting helmets on sticks, lighting cigarettes from hidden trenches, sending decoys to draw her fire. But Pavlichenko rarely fell for traps. Her patience was her defense. She often waited hours before returning a single shot, ensuring that her presence remained untraceable. German radio chatter recorded frustration. They could not find her, yet their officers kept dying. It was psychological erosion, a war of nerves where one woman's stillness dismantled entire chains of command. As her fame grew, her image began to serve functions far beyond the battlefield. To Soviet women, she became proof that participation in war was not limited by gender. To foreign audiences, she symbolized the brutality of the Eastern Front. But beneath those layers of symbolism remained a quiet question: what did vengeance cost her? In the years that followed, when peace returned and the propaganda faded, that question lingered in silence. Pavlichenko never wrote memoirs seeking glory. When she eventually spoke about her experiences, her words were restrained. "War is not about numbers," she said in one interview. "It is about what remains of a person after they are done." That sentence captured the essence of her moral reality. She had survived, but survival itself became its own battlefield. The memory of each face in her scope, the smell of snow mixed with gunpowder, the silence after each shot, these did not fade. They simply changed shape, transforming into the quiet isolation that followed her for the rest of her life. Those who met her in later years described her as kind yet distant, always formal, rarely laughing. Her composure was unshakable because it had to be. To unlearn discipline was to relive the war. In the archives of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, her training notes remain preserved. Diagrams of wind correction, temperature adjustments, bullet trajectory arcs. Each page is immaculate, every line measured. But in the margins of one notebook, faded under age and handling, there is a single sentence written in her own hand: "One must be steady to see clearly." That phrase, though technical, reads like confession. It reflects not just her approach to marksmanship, but her approach to life. To be steady was to survive. To see clearly was to accept what survival required. The morality of her vengeance is not easily defined. History often prefers absolutes, heroes and villains, victory and defeat. Pavlichenko's story resists that simplicity. She was a woman who avenged loss through precision, who found identity in control, and who transformed personal grief into military doctrine. Her revenge did not end with satisfaction. It ended with silence. She proved that justice and violence could coexist, but never without cost. And when the war finally moved beyond Sevastopol, beyond her rifle's reach, the silence that remained was not peace, it was memory. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned from her diplomatic tour in 1943, the war had changed beyond recognition. Stalingrad had fallen, Kursk was burning, and the Red Army was no longer defending, it was advancing. She arrived home to parades, cameras, and speeches, but the front she had left behind no longer existed for her. Her orders were clear. She would no longer return to combat. Her wounds, the doctors insisted, were too severe, and her value as a symbol too great to risk. The rifle that had defined her life was taken from her and placed in a museum. Her war was over not by choice, but by decree. In Moscow, she was assigned to the Chief Political Directorate as an instructor and morale officer. Her days were filled with lectures, inspections, and correspondence. She trained young snipers, sharing techniques that had once been secrets of survival. She demonstrated breathing control, firing sequences, camouflage, and observation. Her students listened to her as if to a relic from legend. She reminded them constantly that a sniper's bullet is not vengeance, it is precision. But behind those lessons, she felt the emptiness of absence. The silence of peacetime was heavier than the roar of battle. As the war reached its climax, her image continued to circulate. Newspapers printed her face beside maps of victories. She appeared at rallies, stoic and measured, delivering speeches that praised sacrifice and endurance. Yet those who knew her personally noticed the quiet fatigue that settled into her eyes. She rarely smiled, and when she did, it seemed rehearsed. The emotional cost of her service, the solitude, the repetition, the unending awareness of death had not left her. It had only become internal. The press called her Lady Death, but she was, in truth, a survivor learning how to live. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was 29 years old. The war had made her famous, but it had also taken her youth. She stood among the crowds in Red Square as fireworks lit the sky, yet she felt detached, as though watching from another time. Victory did not bring relief, it brought silence, and silence reminded her of the cold trenches outside Sevastopol. The war was over, but for her, it never truly ended. In the post-war years, Pavlichenko worked as a historian and lecturer for the Soviet Navy, returning to the academic discipline she had abandoned for war. Her lectures combined tactical analysis with quiet reflections on human endurance. She avoided dramatization. When students asked her about her record, she would correct them. Confirmed kills are not achievements, they are confirmations of necessity. She refused to let her war become legend, even as the state built monuments in her name. By the early 1950s, she had received the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the Order of Lenin, and numerous commendations. But behind the medals lived a deep and chronic melancholy. Her body had healed, her mind had not. Those close to her described recurring nightmares, snow, silence, and the sound of a rifle bolt echoing endlessly. She rarely spoke of her husband, whose death had first sent her to war. Friends noted that she kept his photograph inside a tin box, which she opened only on anniversaries. She never remarried. Her son, born after the war from a brief relationship, recalled that she was gentle but distant, often lost in thought, staring through windows as if waiting for a signal that never came. The war had trained her to endure waiting. Now she could not stop. Despite her emotional isolation, she continued to serve as a public figure. She appeared at veterans' congresses, military academies, and international events. In 1957, she was invited back to the United States to commemorate the wartime alliance. She met Eleanor Roosevelt again, this time not as a soldier, but as a weary survivor. The two women spoke privately for hours, away from cameras. Roosevelt later wrote in her memoirs that Pavlichenko carried the weight of 1,000 unseen ghosts. The reunion was warm but brief. Pavlichenko returned to Moscow quietly, declining most further foreign invitations. As the Cold War deepened, her wartime story was reissued by Soviet propaganda with renewed force. Films, novels, and posters once again made her a symbol of unbreakable will. She tolerated it, but never participated. In interviews, when journalists tried to revive the myth of Lady Death, she redirected the conversation toward education, equality, and peace. "If my story is to mean anything," she once said, "it should remind the world what happens when hatred rules." Her words were simple, but they cut through ideology, a sniper's truth delivered with precision. Time, however, was not kind to her. The physical toll of the war and the shrapnel lodged near her spine caused chronic pain. By the 1960s, She struggled with depression and alcoholism, a pattern common among veterans who lived long enough to face. Quiet. The Soviet system that once celebrated her now largely forgot her, except during commemorations. She lived alone in a small apartment in Moscow, her walls lined with books and fading photographs. Neighbors recalled her as polite, withdrawn, and precise, even in habit. Her shelves were ordered by topic, her medals polished monthly. She was a soldier who never fully laid down arms, only replaced weapons with memories. Her final years passed in relative obscurity. On October 10, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko died at the age of 58, reportedly from a stroke, though friends believed her health had long been deteriorating from years of untreated trauma. The funeral was modest. A few surviving comrades attended, along with military cadets who carried her coffin draped in red. She was buried at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, among writers, generals, and statesmen, fitting, for she had been all three in her way: a storyteller, a soldier, and a fragment of history. The Soviet press released a short obituary, factual, restrained, without sentiment. Hero of the Soviet Union Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko, 1916–1974, sniper of the 25th Rifle Division, with 309 confirmed enemy eliminations. There was no mention of her pain, her isolation, or the long silence that had followed her fame. But those who studied her life understood that her legacy was not measured in numbers or medals. It was measured in transformation. How one woman, driven by loss, reshaped the perception of women in warfare forever. Decades later, historians revisiting the archives began to see her story not only as military history, but as human endurance. She had emerged from a society that expected silence and obedience, yet she proved that precision, intellect, and control could make a woman not just a participant in history, but its author. Her notebooks, preserved in the Central Armed Forces Museum, reveal both sides of her, pages filled with technical data and occasional lines of introspection. One reads, "There is no heroism in surviving. There is only continuation." Modern analysts often frame her as the beginning of psychological warfare, a symbol weaponized by both sides of the conflict. To the Germans, she was terror. To the Soviets, she was inspiration. But to herself, she was simply function, the right person at the right place when her country demanded impossible things. Even her death reflected that balance, quiet, unannounced, yet immovable in significance. Her story endures because it bridges contradiction, vengeance and justice, strength and vulnerability, logic and grief. She never glorified killing, never spoke of triumph, and never romanticized the war. She once said that the greatest victory of her life was not the war she fought, but the fact that she learned to live afterward. That statement, though brief, reveals the true cost of survival. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, peace was not the absence of battle, it was the continuation of stillness. In the end, her life forms a complete circle. A historian turned sniper, a widow turned soldier, a soldier turned witness. Her silence after war was not weakness, it was preservation. She had seen what hatred could do and refused to let it speak through her again. The world remembered her as Lady Death, but history remembers her as something far more complex, the embodiment of discipline forged by pain, precision born from loss, and humanity surviving within the machinery of war. The snow that once covered Sevastopol has long melted, but beneath that soil still lie the echoes of her patience, hundreds of rifles, thousands of bones, and one name written in every report of the siege. For every bullet she fired, there exists a pause that lasts forever, the space between necessity and mercy. That space was her battlefield. That silence was her legacy.